Urgent. The counterattacks by the Ukrainian armed forces have brought Russia to its knees. Putin has big problems. Trump made a new shocking statement. This will determine the fate of the war. The Russian army is on the brink of disaster. Russia is howling. There is simply no equipment. The Ukrainian armed forces stunned everyone with this strike on a crucial facility in the very heart of Russia. All of this and more in our episode of Hotspot. Intense fighting and explosions all across Russia. Fighters from the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade carried out a cleanup operation in the Kharkiv region. Exclusive footage you can't miss. A new breakthrough in the Ukrainian armed forces. Zelensky stated that Kursk is on the negotiation table. The Ukrainian army is confidently tearing through the Russians. All the details in the report.
The occupiers in Russia are in the crosshairs of Ukrainian defenders. Fighters from the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade carried out a cleanup operation in the Kharkiv region. They noted that no Russian occupier will go unpunished. The armed forces of Ukraine are successfully resisting the Russian army, inflicting damage on the enemy, significant losses in personnel and equipment. According to the General Staff on February 23rd, Ukrainian forces destroyed over 1,000 occupiers, 9 tanks and 44 artillery systems. The enemy... Meanwhile, while the occupiers are counting their losses at the front, the Ukrainian armed forces successfully struck the Ryazan oil refineries in Russia. On the night of February 24th, once again, a strike hit the Ryazan oil refinery, which is involved in supplying the Russian occupying army.
It's no coincidence that the strikes are aimed not at the storage facilities for petroleum products, but specifically at valuable equipment, due to the sanctions against the Russian Federation. It's difficult to find replacements for imported components, and that's why the oil refineries are forced to going for an extended repair. I should note that the Ryazan oil refinery is one of the largest oil refineries in Russia. It is located 200 kilometers from the capital, Russian Federation, and it provides logistical support not only to the Russian army but also to the capital region.
This is already the 3rd attack on the plant since the beginning of 2025. In addition, on February 23rd, the defense forces struck a fuel depot in the Tula region. Doctor, I'm going to give you the quality of the gestural process now. Bushanishas, babij. Bushanishas, Bushanishas. These are not the first and won't be the last attacks on Russia's oil refineries. UAVs often fly in for visits, striking military and critical infrastructure targets on the territory of the aggressor country. Meanwhile, the operation in the Kursk region continues, and the Russian army has once again confirmed its inhumanity and brutality. The occupiers shot Ukrainian soldiers and filmed it.
The occupiers is intentionally fully understanding possible informational, political, and accordingly economic, and the consequences for their country. They document war crimes with the aim of exerting psychological pressure on 2 target audiences. These are the direct servicemen of the Ukrainian Defense Forces who are successfully fighting in the Kursk region, and accordingly their family members, meaning the civil society right on the territory of Ukraine. The goal is to sow chaos and panic, distrust in the actions of the central authorities and military leadership.
Let's remember that President Zelensky stated that the Kursk region, part of which is controlled by the armed forces of Ukraine, is not of interest to our country as territory. Zelensky emphasized that part of the Kursk region could be used for an exchange for Ukrainian lands.
Even before Trump's inauguration, there was a report in Bloomberg that should be seen as a controlled information leak, specifically from the Russian side, about the possibility of territorial exchanges, namely the Kursk region, for the occupied territories in several areas of Ukraine. So the Russian Federation, despite the loud statements and the Russian dictator Putin, and accordingly Peskov on the fact that such exchanges are impossible, they fully understand that the continued holding of positions by the Ukrainian Defense Forces in the Kursk region is a colossal informational and political defeat for the Russian side.
Meanwhile, Iran and North Korea are helping Russia continue its bloody war against Ukraine. Russia is increasingly relying on their support, and this is being discussed at the Institute for the Study of War. The Kremlin received Shahed drones from Iran. He also helped Russia establish its own factory for producing Shahed drones in the Republic of Tatarstan. And 50% of the shells used by the Russian army are North Korean munitions. This was stated by the head of the Defense Intelligence of Ukraine, Kyrilo Budanov.
the RF military-industrial complex as a result of personal criminal cases. Sectoral sanctions are practically unable to meet the needs of the Russian army for artillery shells and heavy armored vehicles. So we're talking about the fact that at the moment the Russian Federation is using stocks of Soviet-era weapons, but they are not limitless, and therefore further replenishment, means of destruction, and accordingly logistical support can only be secured through external supplies. First of all, this is North Korea.
And while some are helping the bloody dictator Putin, other civilized countries are severing ties. In support of Ukraine, Australia has implemented its largest sanctions package since 2022 against 70 individuals and 79 organizations linked to Russia.
So the fighters from the 60th Mechanized Brigade are destroying Russian armored vehicles using the American portable Javelin anti-tank missile system. According to the anti-tank soldiers, the most important thing in their work is speed. You can't fire your position too much. I fired the Javelin and ran away fast. We run and hide because the return fire can come very quickly. Since the start of the day, there have already been 62 battles on the front line. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine notes that there are the most Russian assaults in the Pokrovsk direction. The occupying army continues to suffer heavy losses.
Since July 2024, the losses of the Russian occupiers, according to the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, amount to about 150,000 personnel. To understand the nature of the losses, this is the strength of the Western Military District, the army of the occupying country. So the nature of the losses is just colossal. This is in the Pokrovsk direction. Daily losses of the Russian occupiers in the Pokrovsk direction, according to the same main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, are up to 500 personnel. These include both irretrievable losses and accordingly sanitary losses. So we can say that the monthly losses of the occupiers just in the Pokrovsk direction are around 15,000.
In the Lyman area, Ukrainian forces successfully repelled Russian assaults in the area of Novolyubovka in the Luhansk region, as well as in Yampolivka and Zelenaya Dolina in the Donetsk region. The enemy attempted to advance in the area of Petropavlivka, Zarizove, Dvorekne, and the Volchansk-Kharkiv region. In the Kupiansk direction, the Russians are trying to assault without armor, the military says. One of the factors that may influence why the Russians are using less armored equipment is the effective work of our units. As soon as they see the activity of the occupiers, for example, a column of Russian equipment moving, our bombers immediately start taking off. FPV pilots are at work and they are destroying. Andrei Rubtsov, head of the communications department of the 116th Separate Mechanized Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. In an interview with Suspilne, in the Sumy direction, border guards destroyed a Russian howitzer and a pontoon crossing. In the Pokrovsk area, the soldiers of the Krylo unit eliminated a tank, an infantry fighting vehicle, a howitzer, an ammunition depot, military transport, and the infantry of the occupiers.
Among those eliminated was a Russian UAV crew. The occupiers were hiding among the graves in the cemetery. They were destroyed by FPV masters. The main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine on Facebook.
Meanwhile, in the temporarily occupied Crimea, soldiers of the 810th Russian Marine Brigade are trying to avoid being sent to the Kursk region, where the Russian army is suffering heavy losses. According to partisans,
soldiers of the brigade are trying to transfer en masse to other units, realizing that they might be sent to the Kursk region. Rumors that there is almost no chance of returning alive only increase the panic among the personnel. Some of these Russian soldiers have already joined the Atesh and are providing us with valuable information. There is a particular interest in the command of the unit, which the soldiers speak of very unfavorably. The reasons are obvious: a dismissive attitude towards subordinates, coercion to assault, and fear of sabotage among their own soldiers. From a message by the partisan movement Atesh on Telegram.
Here we go. The armed forces of Ukraine have moved forward in Donbass. The Russians are in a fire trap. It's restless in Kursk, but Ukrainian fighters continue their rapid advance there. Atesh, the armed forces of Ukraine just rolled over the Russians, breaking through their defenses. You definitely haven't seen anything like this before. Look.
Ukrainian defense forces have advanced in 2 settlements in the Donetsk region and near the village of Kruglenkaya in the Kursk region.
Pokrovsk direction. Here. In recent days, there have been a number of successful counterattacks by the Ukrainian defense forces. In the area of Vodiane, the Ukrainian defense forces managed to clear the industrial zone. Further ones are coming. The successful actions of the Ukrainian Defense Forces at the moment of taking control of this settlement. In addition to this, the successful nature of the Ukrainian counterattacks in the area of the settlement, Dachinskaya, and it's worth noting the successful actions of the Ukrainian Defense Forces in the area of Pechcha.
Putin set the task of completely capturing, in the near future, the Pokrovsky sector.
The Kremlin dictator considers this territory an important foothold for the subsequent offensive operations of the occupiers deep into the territory of Ukraine. But this is just the desire of the bunker dweller. The enemy is at risk of operational encirclement.
The width of the Russian penetration is up to 7 kilometers. Therefore, the Russians understand perfectly well that in the event of further successful actions by the armed forces of Ukraine in this direction, a serious danger looms over the already existing Russian groupings with the threat of their operational encirclement.
Ukrainian troops are also advancing in the Kursk region, having restored their positions near Kruglenka.
Here, the tactical initiative is with the Ukrainian Defense Forces. There is objective control data indicating the advancement of the Ukrainian Defense Forces into deep territories by about 5 to 7 kilometers depending on the source of information. At the moment, we can say that the Ukrainian Defense Forces have taken control a number of settlements in the Kursk region. Moreover, the area of control of the Ukrainian Defense Forces has expanded by about 100 square kilometers in recent days. These are significant successes for the Ukrainian army.
And what about Taretsko? I understand that the consequences of the meat assaults are becoming harder and harder to hide. The enemy has resorted to their favorite tactic, dispersing fake news. This time in their dreams, they have complete control over Taretsko. But in reality, Taretsko remains Ukrainian and is under the control of the armed forces of Ukraine.
Over the past week, there have been repeated reports in Russian and Western media about the alleged complete takeover of this settlement. This information is not true at the moment. The Ukrainian Defense Forces are holding their ground, positions in the area of the facts of management of Toretsk. This is Toretsk, the dominant height and a number. Other positions, subtitles were made by Dymatorzok, adjacent to this industrial enterprise. Taretsko is the dominant heights that allow the armed forces of Ukraine to maintain fire control. The forces of the area supporting the Russian occupation army, the so-called Kurlov agglomeration.
And although the Ukrainian Defense Forces are showing significant successes, the situation at the front remains tense. The enemy continues to bombard. In the last 24 hours, the enemy carried out 100 airstrikes and dropped 140 bombs on the positions of Ukrainian units and populated areas. In addition, the enemy has carried out about 6,000 shellings. This includes 200 from multiple launch rocket systems and involved 2,853 kamikaze drones.
In total, 139 combat clashes were recorded in the last 24 hours.
But no one left the Russians at a loss either. Plus 1,390 people joined the ranks of the 200s in the last 24 hours. Since the beginning of the large-scale war, the estimated enemy losses have reached 851,280 people.
Trump is demanding a quick end to the war, but Putin has gone all in. The Kremlin is not planning to back down. Putin has rolled out a new ultimatum, and its conditions are simply shocking. France and Britain made urgent, sensational statements. But what are they ready for? Go for peace. What crazy demands has Moscow put forward? Let's break down all the details in the story.
The Russian-American negotiations that took place last week in Riyadh, after almost 3 years of isolation and sanctions, they have elevated the Kremlin to the status of a country with which we need to start negotiating for peace. And perhaps even without Ukraine's involvement, the Trump administration wants quick results regarding the end of the war, but the Kremlin has other plans for this matter.
Negotiations with the U.S. in themselves are a victory, as they help to end the isolation imposed on Moscow by the Biden administration. The Kremlin is already laying the groundwork for endless negotiations. In the meantime, Russia is likely to put forward conditions similar to those it presented during the negotiations in Istanbul at the beginning of the war. During those negotiations, Russia demanded that there be no foreign weapons on Ukrainian territory. and that the Ukrainian army should be reduced to a certain size, limiting everything from the number of troops and tanks to the maximum range of Ukrainian missiles.
In future lengthy negotiations, Russia plans to use a tactic of escalating demands by improving its positions on the battlefield. And even sitting down at the negotiating table, the Kremlin does not plan to stop military actions.
We are ready to negotiate with Ukraine, with Europe, with any representatives who, in a spirit of goodwill, would like to help achieve peace. But we will only stop military actions when these negotiations yield a solid, sustainable result, satisfactory to the Russian Federation.
The American Adziano publication. The Wall Street Journal reports that Putin wants to control the size of the Ukrainian armed forces and Ukraine's neutrality.
He wants to put an end to the exchange of intelligence between Washington and Kyiv, which neither side officially acknowledges and which has helped Ukraine strike some of the most sensitive Russian targets.
Understanding the criticality of the situation, the leaders of France and the UK will try to dissuade Trump from negotiating with Russia. On Monday, French President Emmanuel Macron arrived in Washington for a meeting with Trump, where he proposed the plan for the deployment of European forces on Ukrainian territory. Right now, we're talking about 30,000 peacekeepers. France and the UK should play a leading role in the mission. With these actions, Macron wants to refute the narrative of Europe's weakness.
If you allow Russia to take over Ukraine, it will be a disaster for Europeans and the whole world. But that's not all. Russia will become even stronger. She will continue to invest, but will also take Ukraine and its army for herself. One of the largest in Europe, with all our equipment, including, American. This is a huge strategic mistake. We want peace, but we do not want a ceasefire that would amount to Ukraine's capitulation, because that is dangerous. And we know that this will lead to further aggression from Russia.
On Thursday, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer will meet with Trump. He will also try to dissuade US President Donald Trump from bilateral negotiations with Russia.
Right now, we have a chance.
Right now, we have the opportunity to establish the fundamental principles for lasting peace. If we want lasting peace, then Ukraine must be at the negotiating table. And we must establish sovereignty for Ukraine and strong security guarantees. The UK is ready to support this with its troops in Ukraine. In exchange for refusing to negotiate with Russia, Macron and Starmer promised Trump to take on the responsibility of ensuring future security.
Right now, the task is to prevent Trump from choosing the most straightforward solution for Ukraine in his eagerness to end the war as quickly as possible. And even if we can just delay that moment, it already plays into Ukraine's hands. It allows us to complicate the negotiations, convey some additional points to Trump's advisors, and tell them that Ukraine's task is to strike and enhance the fighter's own reputation.
On the anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the UK, Norway, Spain, and Denmark announced new sanctions packages against the aggressor. And the old world is ready to support Ukraine financially and with military technology under any conditions. Our European partners are trying to convince Trump not to sit down at the negotiating table with Russia without Ukraine.
Right now, it is burning and blazing. Hellish explosions erupted in Russia. These strikes have been decisive. The armed forces of Ukraine hit significant targets. Several oil refineries have been blown up. Right now, exclusive video of the arrival in Russia. Look,
Novochakhtinsk, the oil refinery. Tuapse oil refinery. Druzhba pipeline. This is far from a complete list of the oil refining industry facilities in Russia that were attacked by Ukrainian drones and missiles in 2024. In the past year, there were over 80 attacks on oil refining facilities and fuel bases located in Russia, annexed Crimea, and the occupied territories of Ukraine. Beginning 2025 has become even more nightmarish for the industry that directly finances Russia's war in Ukraine. The number of attacks has only increased.
The number of oil refinery, the factories that have been hit by our drone strikes make up half of the refineries. That is if we would have been able to suppress them and not therefore to damage, as they say in Russian, to damage, yes. To damage, that was actually about hockey more than 50%, so the chosen path is the right one. This led to a reduction in production by about 14%. I think...
Since the beginning of 2025, at least 27 fuel and energy facilities have been attacked in 16 regions of Russia. The most strikes on refineries were in the Krasnodar Krai, with at least 5 shellings. Facilities were also hit by shelling in the Bryansk, Belgorod, Nizhny Novgorod, Smolensk, Volgograd, Rostov, Kaluga, Saratov, Ik, Ryazan, Oryol, Voronezh, Astrakhan, Samara, Tula regions, and the Republic of Tatarstan. Both the refineries that supply fuel for Russian military equipment and the factories that provide fuel for the domestic market have come under attack. An important economic factor. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky also noted the strikes on Russian refineries.
For every $2 invested in our long-range capabilities, we are already inflicting almost $10 in losses on Russia. This is the necessary dynamic. Russia needs to feel the cost of war in order to truly desire peace.
The series of drone attacks led to unscheduled equipment repairs under the conditions of Western technological sanctions. Last year, the attacks by Ukrainian drones. Production at Russian refineries has collapsed to a 12-year low. In 2025, the number of raids only increased, and this will lead to an even greater decline.
According to reports from the Russian Federation itself, the oil refinery in the Nizhny Novgorod region has suspended production after drone strikes from the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense. A similar fate befell the Syzran oil refinery, which, by the way, it's located just 200 kilometers from the Russian capital, and it provided fuel and lubricants not only for the Russian army, but also primarily for the capital region. The Ukrainian side can have a significant impact not only on the economic potential of the Russian Federation, but also primarily disrupt the logistics of the occupying forces.
In addition to the economic Moscow's attack, the strikes on refineries also have a psychological impact. Russians see the war not just on TV as something far away, but right next to them in their own lives.
In addition to the economic and military impact, there is also a moral and psychological one. Representatives of the deep people also observe that the war is not just on TV, but maybe even close by.
On the night of Wednesday, February 19th, Ukrainian drones seriously damaged the Syzran oil refinery. The operation of the plant, which produced fuel, aviation kerosene, and bitumen, played an important role in supplying the Russian army. Suspended indefinitely, and such a fate awaits all. The aggressor's refinery.
Well, meanwhile, there's a real disaster in the Russian army. There's nothing left to fight with. The Kremlin claims to be ramping up mass production of armored vehicles to compensate for last year's losses. But there's a catch. Are the occupiers' tanks really running out? And what will this lead to on the battlefield? Let's break down the details.
Russia was able to cover its losses in tanks in 2024. However, moving forward, the aggressor country will find this difficult, according to the Institute for the Study of War.
Where does it come from? What equipment do the Russians have? Well, production. Second, restoration of that Soviet equipment from storage bases that has been on Russian territory for all these 30 years. And third, the restoration of the equipment that was damaged or destroyed in the troops themselves was hit or damaged in the troops themselves.
The stock of military equipment is not unlimited, and it makes perfect sense that they will eventually run out. According to the UK National Institute for Strategic Studies, by 2024, Russia will have managed to compensate for all its tank losses, and about 75% of the losses in armored vehicles that it has suffered in the war with Ukraine.
Putin has a strong desire to purchase and acquire equipment from abroad. Yes. They often turn to African and Asian countries where they previously sold their T-72s. They previously sold the same armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles in order to buy them back. Well, there is such a trickle, but it's not that extensive. As a result, that in the global south, when they are paying attention to and observing the sanctions from the United States and the European Union.
Experts note that Russia's ongoing efforts to increase the size of its armed forces and create new units only exacerbate the shortage of equipment.
If before the large-scale invasion, the production of the Russians were trying to develop some new types of tanks based on old Soviet designs to improve the T-90. And then there is the very one, the infamous Armata. Right now, it's not about luxury. The main focus is on restoring old Soviet equipment or production. Again, new models, but considering that the most important thing is the optics. The control systems that they were purchasing previously, European manufactured, they can't get them. That's why they are being equipped with devices. Those that are in warehouses at the same storage bases with old equipment from the 60s, 50s.
Such production of Russian equipment certainly allows for a quantitative increase in supplies, but not a qualitative one.
The equipment is being restored. It can shoot, it can drive, but it's a quality far from even the Soviet and Russian standards that are set for it. Even at the storage base, the equipment that has been there for such a long time becomes unfit for operation. This applies not only to the devices, not only to the barrels, not only to the automation engines, but also the tank hulls. A few people know who are not involved with armored vehicles that under the weight of the tank itself, in 10-15 years, the deflection, the bottom of the tank appears, which manufacturers consider unacceptable.
According to analysts, there is a high likelihood that the tanks and armored vehicles from the Soviet era remaining in Russia's warehouses are in poor condition. This could complicate Russia's ability to compensate for high equipment losses in 2025 and beyond.
Attacking in old Zhigulis or Ladas has now become a reality for the so-called Second Army in the world. Here's one of the latest vivid examples. On the Luhansk front, the liberators are breaking through in pink Zhigulis. The stocks of military equipment for the Russians are rapidly depleting and they cannot be replenished. Therefore, the only solution is civilian. Automotive industry.
Lada cars, not just the Zhiguli models, but also the slightly more powerful Nivas, have started to appear in large numbers in Russian assault units as the stocks of armored vehicles began to deplete significantly a few months ago.
The reasons for such losses are the Ukrainian drones, which are conducting a real hunt on the front lines as soon as even one Russian tank appears.
According to the Russian side, Ukraine has total superiority in FPV drones. This is what allows the Ukrainian defense forces to neutralize the numerical advantage of the enemy in heavy armored vehicles.
In a scene from the publication of the American edition Forbes, it is claimed that the use of Zhiguli by the Russian army could become a turning point.
When the first Russian assault teams climbed into their Zhiguli cars last fall and set out on near-suicidal attacks across the drone-patrolled no-man's land in eastern Ukraine, one could have dismissed the attacks using Zhiguli as isolated incidents carried out by the most desperate and equipment-deprived Russian units. It's no longer realistic to paint such a rosy picture of the Russian army's mechanization efforts. With losses of armored vehicles and other heavy equipment exceeding 15,000, the attacks using Zhiguli are becoming increasingly common.
The losses of armored vehicles in the Russian army are approximately 6,000 units per year. Previously, the Kremlin replenished these losses by unearthing Soviet-era equipment, but now there is almost none left, as these stocks are not limitless.
The Russian Federation currently has the ability to produce heavy armored vehicles up to 200 units per year. But considering the losses on the front lines, these figures are minimal and don't even address tactical levels. The task of the occupying army in Ukraine, therefore, the Russian defense industry at the moment, the priority is not on production, but rather on the restoration of armored vehicles. It should be noted that these are mostly old tanks. These are the T-55, T-54, T-62. 5
Of course, the assaults in 2025 are different from the assaults at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, since the occupier realized that large mechanized breakthroughs only lead to significant losses in equipment and personnel. But the attacks on the Zhiguli also indicate that the Russian army is reaching a critical point in terms of restoring its equipment.
The normalization of attacks on Ladas is a clear sign that this turning point has been crossed. With each day of Russia's increasingly large-scale war in Ukraine, the Russians will have less and less armored vehicles, and they will increasingly rely on compact cars to transport troops into battle.
Going into an attack in a Zhiguli is clearly a one-way ticket. And does this lucky ticket want to be pulled out by the Russian soldier?
That's all for now. You can catch more fiery news from the front in the next episode.